Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't know about the graveyard slot, but I can tell you all the other parties would be happy for this to be their keynote slot. So many people here this afternoon, and we may know that UKIP is the fastest growing political party in Britain, and in fact we seem to be the only growing political party in Britain. The Liberal Democrats, believe it or not, had about 70,000 members when Nick Clegg took over, and they say they're hovering above 40,000 now. The Tories had 250,000 when David Cameron took over and are down to 134,000. But I must admit, I was quite excited when UKIP crashed through the 20,000 barrier in December. But you probably all know by now, we went through 30,000 in the summer, and it carries on going up. Now, if we carry on with the present trends, by the time we reassemble next year, UKIP could well be a bigger party than the Liberal Democrats. And I can tell you, once those lines on the graph have crossed, they will never cross back again. Now, I could present to you today a long list of statistics showing why Britain would be more likely to prosper outside the EU, but some of our most eminent economists have already done that job, from the great Professor Congdon, and what an important advocate he is for Britain leaving, to Professor Minford and many others besides. So today I want to do something a little bit different. I want to ask a challenging question for all of us of an anti-EU disposition, and then to attempt to answer it. And the question is this: why do so many top captains of industry support EU membership if EU membership is bad for the British economy? Only this week, Simon Walker, the head of the Institute of Directors, said most of his members would prefer renegotiation to leaving. And the CBI is, if anything, even more pro-EU membership still. Now, one could resort to the Marxist device of false consciousness here and say that these people are highest earning captains of industry, the people in the blue chip boardrooms don't know what's good for them or their businesses. And it's very tempting to do so, because by and large, they're the same bunch who said Britain needed to get into the European single currency or we would miss out on a huge wave of prosperity. Now, they've been proved wrong about that. Messrs Branson and Sorrell and Roland Rudd, who we heard about earlier, and the rest. Friends of Mandelson, we could call them. You'll remember the scare stories. Inward investment would dry up, important companies would leave, and the city would be marginalised. In fact, just the opposite happened. We led the field for inward investment outside the Eurozone. The city grew faster than ever until it went pop all of its own accord, but that's a different story. And most importantly, we were not on the hook for the enormous debts run up by southern European governments, although we'd managed to run up quite a few of our own. And yet, I really wouldn't like to rely on this view that these highest earning business figures in the country are simply unaware of which side their bread is buttered. I think if we entered a referendum campaign on that basis, we might come unstuck. So fortunately, there is another explanation, and to my mind, a more compelling and convincing one. You see, these people are by definition the highest paid business leaders in the country, at the head of very big, very profitable, very well-established businesses. If they weren't, then Lord Mandelson probably wouldn't bother to have them in his address book, because after all, he's always preferred the have-yachts to the have-nots. So, of course, they don't want anything much to change because the money is still pouring in for them. They consider at the very least terminating membership of the EU would risk upsetting their cosy arrangements and looking at life from their very narrow viewpoint of their own self-interest, it probably would. It's just the rest of us who stand to gain from a freer and more flexible economy where innovators can break into markets more easily, small companies can grow, and big complacent ones can fall by the wayside if they fail to deliver what customers want. Now consider the evidence. The European single market is extremely highly regulated. To trade inside it successfully, any business needs to constantly keep abreast of all the new regulations coming out of Brussels and keep adapting to obey them. Product specification, health and safety, employment law in general, the paperwork never stops. Established dominant businesses that can afford large compliance teams can not only cope with this regulatory burden, they can actually turn it to their advantage because it effectively amounts to a barrier to entry to smaller businesses and competitors. It also leaves the EU market as a high-price market, one in which consumers pay through the nose because all the regulatory hurdles and costs, including crippling energy costs, that go to getting goods and services to market. The drawback for even the biggest companies, of course, is that they will find it hard to sell goods made inside the single market into cheaper markets elsewhere in the world, especially where there are tariff barriers to clear and indeed the energy costs I just mentioned, which are so much higher in Europe than elsewhere. But because most of these very big companies are multinational companies, that doesn't really matter to them. They're able to open factories and plants across the world where the same employment controls, regulations and costs do not apply, and then they can use this output to sell into the cheaper but faster growing international markets. So it's a cushy number for the big boys, is this single market, with a tariff barrier around it to prevent global price competition benefiting European consumers, and all manner of regulatory challenges for the small trader or the innovative company trying to break into a market. I think the measure is now down to about 9% of UK economic output, which is sold into the other EU countries. Yet 100% of output is governed by complex and expensive single market rules and constrained by those enormously high energy costs that our businesses have to bear. So in business terms, I put it to you that EU membership benefits the established few and not the innovative many. By making it harder for new players to get going, it sucks the dynamism out of our economy, hampering our ability to compete at a global level too. And there's an even more important way in which the economics of EU membership favours the few and hurts the many, because employers, big and small alike, do share in an undoubted bottom line benefit, an unlimited supply of cheap, predominantly Eastern European labour. But consider the cost to the average British citizen. In recent years, private sector wages, particularly in the unskilled, semi-skilled, manual sectors, have fallen way behind the highly unionised public sector on the one hand, the professional occupations, let alone executive remuneration in blue-chip boardrooms. And they've fallen behind the cost of living too. It's not the lawyers or the chief executives or the political class who have seen their living standards decimated. It's the builders and the scaffolders and the plumbers and the farm hands and the cleaning ladies and the production line workers and the catering staff too. I would suggest this is because these are the sectors by far the most exposed to Eastern European labour. So British workers, or at least a substantial section of them, are losing out from a central condition of EU membership, not just in pay rises, but also in the ease of finding a job And don't we know that with the unemployment levels among our young people coming out of schools and colleges? But there's another even larger group of Britons who are also on the hook, and that's ordinary taxpayers. Because where you have a very highly developed welfare state of ours, the economics of free movement of labour from countries with much lower living standards just simply don't stack up, particularly at the bottom end of the employment market. Consider for a moment someone coming from Bulgaria to do a minimum wage job in Britain. He'll probably pay about £1,000 a year in income tax and will marginally increase GDP if we make the heroic assumption that no Briton could be found to do the job he's filled, or at least to do it as well. But even if he has a couple of children of school age, he'll cost straight away £10,000 in public spending via the education budget alone. And that's before one even considers demands on the NHS, policing, housing, transport, child benefit, or a panoply of other public services. So the open borders policy, which is a prerequisite of EU membership, leads to the privatising of profits from migration among a very small and privileged group of people, but a socialising of what can be much bigger losses. It's a similar thing that happened when the big banks were bailed out by the ordinary taxpayer. Seen from this perspective, no wonder the big battalions are protective of EU membership. Many of you in this hall will believe in a free market economy. And it's great when it works. It's undoubtedly the most brilliant engine of prosperity that's ever been devised. Yet what we have in this country far too often is not a free market economy, but a rigged market economy. And the EU is a central factor behind that. It's a rigged market that benefits a few at the top and leaves the system vulnerable to lobbyists, to implicit soft cartels in industries where there simply aren't enough competitors in the marketplace, while suppressing new competition, ripping off consumers, and putting unreasonable burdens on ordinary taxpayers. I recall a year or two back doing a radio discussion, I think it was on BBC Radio Solent, about the Daily Express crusade to get Britain out of the EU. And they'd earlier recorded a clip with Chris Huhne, who was in those days a member of Her Majesty's government and not a guest at Her Majesty's pleasure. Now, in those days, Mr. Huhne had pointed out that Britain exported less to the BRIC economies combined than it had done to Ireland alone, and cited this as evidence that leaving the EU would be a disaster. But he'd got it exactly wrong. He'd muddled cause and effect. He had been mistaken about what or who was driving these events and who was being driven by them. And it wasn't the first time, as it turned out, he'd be confused about such an issue. Seen from the analysis I've presented, it was the fact of our EU membership and those crippling energy costs and the high regulation and the tariff barriers that was leading our industries and our economy to be disastrously skewed towards this very sluggish, declining European market and away from the rapidly growing markets of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the rest, to be exporting more to a debt-ridden, shell-shocked and recession-hit economy of 4 million souls in the Republic of Ireland than to 4 continental-sized sunrise economies made up of almost 3 billion people did not represent a triumph of the EU, but a disaster. It underlined that Britain's economy had become skewed and orientated to all the places where growth wasn't to be found. So I suggest to you, if we want to win the economic argument, we should not attempt to do it on the basis that Messrs. Branson or Rudd do not know what's good for their own businesses, but on the basis that it's not good for the economy as a whole or the people who work in it. After all, most British people have now, for the best part of a decade, been getting poorer, or at least no better off, every year. while it's only the blue-chip executive class that's been pocketing double-digit annual pay rises. Our economy is growing again now, but real wages are continuing to fall very fast. For the first time in living memory, British capitalism is not producing a generational increase in living standards, but the opposite. And that's a massive shift in our economic culture, and it's unsurprisingly produced massive fall in trust with the established political parties and their policies. EU membership, as even its advocates admit, is a central part of our economic settlement. So at the very least, it's tainted by this failure, and it's lost the benefit of the doubt. Where a status quo amounts to a guarantee that you'll be worse off next year than you were this year, and worse off still the year afterwards, it rapidly loses its appeal. Now, you may have heard that another passionate advocate of EU membership has been ticking along very nicely financially too, a certain Anthony Charles Linton Blair. That always gets a guaranteed boo or hiss. He wrote a piece recently for the London Evening Standard, headlined, "For Britain to leave the EU would be economic suicide." Now, I read it mainly so you didn't have to. And four paragraphs in, there was a rather curious statement. "We should be clear," wrote Mr. Blair, "of course Britain could both survive and maintain its economy outside the EU. Of course we could still form alliances, play a role in the world, and would retain, at least for a time, our permanent status in the UN Security Council. And by leaving, there would be certain additional flexibilities, especially around legislation that we would gain." Well, that's a funny kind of suicide, isn't it? Where the patient continues to survive and prosper. But of course, definitions have always been rather elastic in the hands of Mr. Blair. And to be fair to him, which is important because life is sometimes unkind, he did go on to cite what he thought were apparent disadvantages of leaving. Trade deals, he claimed, would be more beneficially conducted with other big economic players under the umbrella of the EU, ignoring the fact that the current arrangements drastically curtail our ability to sign our own deals with countries that would love to increase bilateral trade with us. Our allies want to stay in too, wrote Mr. Blair. "Don't listen to me," he said. "Listen to the people whom we have presently as allies, from President Obama through to the PM of Japan." Well, certainly contradicting America is not something that Mr. Blair has done for a very long time. And yet the Syria experience, where UKIP played a central role in speaking up for the British public, has shattered this fear of isolation. We didn't lose influence during this episode. We gained it. America and France copied us in demanding parliamentary votes. They slowed down the charge to military intervention, and a better outcome, or the prospect of one, has emerged. We have our status enhanced. No longer are we coated in the bubble perm of the poodle, but once more we're the guard dog of our own national interest. Now, the British people drew back from this American foreign policy because of their experience of the disastrous entanglements of the past decade. And I believe the economic disaster that's befallen them, especially because of the impact of unlimited immigration, can have a similar effect on the debate about our country's relationship with continental Europe. The 21st century won't be a European century. We know that already. It's shaping up to be an Asian century, potentially an African century too. Our old Commonwealth allies will see some of the fastest growth rates on the planet. But the EU elite clings for dear life to the euro, even though it leaves half its members trapped in a downward spiral of falling living standards and contracting economic activity. The debate has changed. Britain is no longer the sick man of Europe. Europe is the sick man of the world. The big opportunities are outside the EU. I just want to finish by saying this, that the big, crucial argument to get over is that the EU has facilitated the creation of these great oligopolies that have misruled our country and misdirected its economy for 25 years or more. The little people, the self-employed, the small businesses, the medium-sized ones too, have been squished. This message can resonate with working-class former Labour voters just as strongly as with business people who once viewed the Conservatives as their champions. So let's not pretend the captains of the corporate giants don't know which side their bread is buttered on, but let's focus on which side our bread is buttered on. Thank you.